I think it's fair to say that I have a bit of an obsession with the Souls franchise. I mean, this is a series that really speaks to me as a gamer, and ever since discovering the Souls formula, I haven't been able to put it down, and I haven't been able to get enough, even though I've played all of the games multiple times over at this point. And many people credit Demon Souls as really being the beginning of the modern Souls formula. Games like Elden Ring or even Night Rain would not exist had it not been for Demon Souls. However, as much as that is still true, it's also equally as fair to say that Demon Souls wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for the grandfather of the Souls franchise, and this being a series called Kingsfield. Now, I can't sit here and tell you that this game series is nostalgic to me because I used to play it back in the day when I was a kid or whatever, and I'm sure there's some of you out there that actually did play Kingsfield when it came out, but I would say that most of my audience probably hasn't played this for themselves. You may have heard of it, but I doubt very many of you played it like in the years that it actually came out. These games go back as far as the mid-90s, and the first Kingsfield released in 1994, and I was still a couple of years away from even being born. I was not yet even a single-celled organism by the time the first Kingsfield released to the public, and that means that yes, it is quite old, and it is somewhat ancient in terms of video game history, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or uninteresting. In fact, I would argue quite the contrary. This game actually reflects many of the key fundamentals of the games in FromSoftware's catalog that we see even now. So much of the game's philosophical fundamentals of how it's built started in Kingsfield, but obviously throughout the years, they got access to better technology, the games got bigger, more complex, they were able to do more things. And something interesting to note is that many of you modern FromSoftware fans, myself included, know that the Moonlight Greatsword is pretty much the through line of all of their games. This has appeared in basically every title, maybe minus Sekiro unless you include the Divine Dragon's boss weapon, but either way, the Moonlight Greatsword makes an appearance in every title regardless, and it does take on slightly different appearances, but it is always present. This goes back even farther than Demon Souls to the first Kingsfield game. This is going to be a retrospective and a look back at all of the Kingsfield games and really determining how this started and where it concluded, and how this led us into the modern Souls series that many of us have fallen in love with. Now, why did I decide to sit down and play a 30-year-old game franchise on my YouTube channel? Well, this really started because I've gotten pretty into collecting retro video game stuff lately, and one of the natural conclusions of that is, with how much I love the Souls franchise, that I should go and actually collect the Kingsfield games and play those too, because I didn't want to play these on emulators. The thing is, Kingsfield is so old that it's actually really hard to get your hands on now unless you're emulating. Emulators also come with their own handful of downsides and complexities, and I figured, with how much I love collecting retro video games, I wanted to play Kingsfield the way God intended, on the hardware that it was built for with physical game copies, and I did just that. Before we get into the dark, silly, fascinating, and incredible journey that is the Kingsfield experience, it's important to understand the naming scheme for this franchise because it's a little bit confusing, but I'll make this as clear as possible. FromSoftware released the first Kingsfield game in 1994, and this was never released in the United States. It never had an official drop. So what I'm going to be referring to as Kingsfield 1 is the original Kingsfield from Japan. However, there was another game already being produced around the same time, which ended up being Kingsfield 2 in Japan. However, in the US and in Europe, this is Kingsfield 1. So the way that I'm going to do this is including the original title as KF1. So if I ever say Kingsfield 3, for example, and you see this, that's why. So in other words, there's 4 total Kingsfield games, but they all kind of shift back one number, if that makes sense. And in the US, the Ancient City isn't even called Kingsfield 4, it's just the Ancient City. FromSoftware was first founded on November 1st, 1986, with the intention and the original goal of developing business software for those applications. However, after a couple of years of developing business software, they decided to give get into video games. The original PlayStation console released on December 3rd of 1994 and was an amazing hit at E3, and so the PlayStation got a later release that year in the US and Europe in 95. Kingsfield 1 was one of the very first games ever developed for this hardware. But as I said, at the time, nobody outside of Japan had access to the original copies of Kingsfield, so this was a region exclusive, meaning it didn't quite have the worldwide popularity or appeal that the later games would eventually have. Kingsfield 1 is also the most simple and basic game of the series because of the limitations of the time, and also because it was FromSoftware's real first attempt at a video game like this. Kingsfield 1 basically consists of 5 main levels, which is actually very similar to Demon's Souls. But a major delineation between these two games is that in Demon's Souls, you do have 5 worlds or 5 levels, and you can kind of tackle them in almost any order you want, more or less. But in Kingsfield, you have to start at level 1 and go in a linear order all the way down to 5. The levels do get slightly more complex, you get deeper into the world, and things get more crazy as you go down. I would compare it in that way a little bit to Bloodborne, where it starts off, very normal, so to speak, and then it gets insane near the end. It doesn't quite go that far with it, but that's the idea, is the levels get slightly more complex as you reach the end and the deepest point. In terms of gameplay, the Kingsfield 1 original experience is rough, and not just speaking from the perspective of the visuals, because, you can look at your screen, it looks like Minecraft, even though this game preceded Minecraft by about 2 decades. The visuals are difficult to stomach, especially given that we're used to making FromSoftware having visuals more like this. This in comparison feels difficult to wrap your head around, to say the least. My girlfriend couldn't even stand to look at the walls because as you move around, the pixels shift and it's almost nauseating. You could say that in a way, its very rudimentary visuals are kind of the charm aspect to Kingsfield as well, and I would actually agree with that. After playing all of the games, Kingsfield 4 takes a very different visual approach, and while I like a lot of what Kingsfield 4 does, there is something to be said about this style and these visuals specifically that are only really present in the first 3 games. Also, I would point out that the first 3 Kingsfield games are all self-contained in the Verdite Chronicles, where the ancient city is really its own storyline and is kind of a reboot for the series, so in terms of narrative and stuff, it doesn't really connect to these first 3 games. They're pretty self-contained in that way. The story of the first game ultimately is pretty simple. You play as a master swordsman named John, or Jean, however you want to pronounce it, and your goal ultimately is to get the Moonlight Sword and break the curse on Verdite. It's pure, unadulterated fantasy story stuff. There's no subtext, there's no, baggage with it. It's just a fantasy story, and that's it. We discussed the level design structure of the original Kingsfield game being basically 5 different floors, or 5 levels that all start to scale up in complexity, have different enemy types, and new weapons that you can find. Now, when you start exploring first in Kingsfield, you're going to encounter your first couple of enemies, and in classic FromSoftware fashion, they do basically nothing to explain anything about how the game works. There's no combat tutorial, there's no over-explaining how to use abilities or what items do. The combat is simple in a way, yet also intricate and complex in the way that we would expect for modern FromSoftware. Even though it is a lot more rudimentary and I would say antiquated here, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas weren't there from the start. The combat flow basically has you having an HP bar, which you can see, an MP bar for your magic, obviously, and if you've played other Souls games, you might be thinking, hey, wait, something's missing. There's no stamina bar. The way that this game handles stamina is the biggest difference, because technically, or at least in most of the games, you can pretty much infinitely use attacks or swing, but your power bar is actually what determines how hard a move will hit. So you want to back up, wait for the enemy to whiff, and then hopefully for your power bar to increase and then get another hit in. This is very interesting because then you can also start using magic to try to stun lock enemies in their animation to get another powerful hit in, or something like that. Enemies also do not have health bars, so you don't know how much health an enemy has left. You kind of have to guess sometimes, especially when encountering new enemies, because otherwise if you miss time that, you will die. But once you get a handle on a certain enemy type on a specific floor, because they're usually pretty uniform in this game, then you can kind of know like how many hits you need for your weapon to kill something, assuming you have full power. It's a pretty interesting combat system. Again, not nearly anything as intricate as we get now, but for the year that this game came out, is pretty well thought out. If you're a Souls veteran or you've played nearly all of the Souls titles, then you're probably familiar with the healing concept of Estus flasks, or even in Elden Ring, you have your flask of cerulean tears or whatever. It's just like, it's a bottle of a thing, or even in Bloodborne, you have vials. And the one exception to all of this is Demon Souls. They just have grass that you can collect to heal, and you might think that that's a weird choice for that game, but the grass as a healing mechanic literally came from Kingsfield. In all of the Kingsfield games, you have what are essentially these earth herbs that are basically like your normal grass. You also have the antidote grass, which also literally appears in Demon Souls. Now, it's just curious to me because this system, in terms of having infinite healing, was a problem in Demon Souls because you could stack up almost infinitely on healing items. I mean, in the remaster, they actually fixed that, but in the original game, there was really no limit to how much grass you could carry, and this would completely break boss encounters. This idea literally came from Kingsfield because you can essentially carry as much as you want, especially in these first couple of games, but also you can pause the game or at least pull up your equipment menu to just apply health again. Like, you don't need to back up and tactically decide when you're going to heal. It's just really about clicking into the menu and then using the healing item. It's very interesting. Now, curiously, when it comes to building your character as you do in an RPG game like this, in normal Elden Ring or Dark Souls or whatever, we're used to having shields be like an equipable item you're wearing that you can use in combat, and you can equip shields here in Kingsfield, but you don't actually use it in combat. Shields just basically become a part of your player's overall defense. It's like a piece of armor, essentially, and that was a little bit different because I was trying to figure out how to use the shield, only to realize that it's just a part of my character. The first game has pretty simple RPG player mechanics in terms of the equipment you're going to run or weapons you're going to find, and Kingsfield 1 ends with you finding the Moonlight Greatsword, or basically getting it given to you from a fairy. And there's actually, contrast to every other FromSoftware game, this one actually has a happy ending. Wait a second, you mean FromSoftware made a game that is not the most depressing thing you've ever seen? That's actually a very different change of pace. It was quite refreshing. The original Kingsfield game is simple. However, despite its simplicity, it had a lot of very fascinating ideas that still resonate into our modern day game design that I don't think would have even been possible had it not been for the foundation that this game laid, and also the foundation that would be later Kingsfield games as well. I had mentioned that the original game was only released in Japan. That's obviously what I've been referring to this whole time as Kingsfield 1, but there was another game being developed pretty much alongside it that released very shortly after the drop of the first game that would be released in Europe and in the US. However, they just started the naming sequence over, so in those regions, it's just Kingsfield, but to Japan, this is Kingsfield 2. Now, in terms of physical copies, I have the Japanese box set with all of the Japanese discs, which have to be played on a either region-free console or a Japanese-specific PlayStation, and I played Kingsfield 1 on the Japanese PlayStation, but given that it was in this box set, the other US Kingsfield games I ended up getting individually, so we can actually read the back of the box, and it's kind of funny, so I want to read this to you. Enter a world of forgotten lore where mighty dragons power the will of the evil Necron, where lost souls and high elves mysteriously disappear, and where kings hunger for the return of the Moonlight Sword. Prepare yourself for an epic adventure never before paralleled. A vast three-dimensional world unfolds with the island of Malant. The world is at your command as you search for the coveted Moonlight Sword in 360-degree of texture-mapped, fully rendered dungeons. Look up, look down, look out. 3D rendered skeletons and dragons will jump out of the screen as you fight for your life. Imagine yourself free to climb ancient ruins, traverse oceans, jump off ridges, and duel enemies at your whim. You will find yourself pulled into a spectacular, non-linear, real-time reality. Will you find the Moonlight Sword, or will you slowly succumb to the mysterious powers of Melant? Your courage will decide, and now your journey begins. Also, exciting gameplay, amazing realism, beautiful 3D polygon graphics, complex characters, and fully controllable 360-degree viewing. Also, I saw this thing at the bottom that says includes bonus hint line collector's card good for 5 free minutes, which I can only assume is like a number you call that. Like, I don't know, I just imagine there's some guy on the other line and you get to talk to him for 5 minutes and he just like tells you what to do or how to play or something like that. So going through the manual, I actually found the phone number that is the hint line, and I called it. Okay, lads, I am calling this phone number. I'm gonna put on speaker.
The call you are attempting to place is not allowed from this line. Please dial 611 for customer service or dial 1-800-331-0500 from a landline phone.
Well, I guess I can't get Kingsfield hints. The line is 95 cents a minute, so I guess I'm screwed. But anyways, all jokes aside, Kingsfield 2 was the US and Europe's first real taste at this franchise, and I think it makes a stellar impact. Now, that might seem silly, again, given that the antiquated nature and the visuals of this game doesn't look like anything spectacular, but if Kingsfield 1 structurally is built like Demon Souls and having 5 hard segmented levels, Kingsfield 2 is actually built like Dark Souls 1, where you essentially have one big world and it's all interconnected in very interesting ways, and you have a lot of the same like setups and payoffs and push and pulls of tension that you do in the original Dark Souls. It was delightful for me to find that out when I was playing, because it's exactly what I wanted out of it. As opposed to Kingsfield 1, in which you spawn in a very linear dungeon that you just clear in a very straightforward manner, you spawn in on the coast of Melant this time, in which there's actually a couple of different paths open to you and a few ones that are not so obvious as well. A first-time player is probably going to wander around and either get smoked by the kraken that's standing here, you might fall off the edge and drown in the water, or you might run off the bridge and not make it to the other side. There's a lot of ways that things can go wrong in the early game of Kingsfield, and again, in typical FromSoftware fashion, they don't do anything to explain the game to you. Honestly, I think it would be very difficult for a new player in modern day to pick this up without any hints, any guides, anything like that, and really try to figure out what's going on. The first couple of hours can be rough. I mean, I would even say that's true of Dark Souls if you are not familiar with the series or anything before. A first-time player is going to have a hard time picking up Dark Souls 1, and Kingsfield is very much the same. Something really important I forgot to mention when we were talking about Kingsfield 1 is how game progression and structure works, where, you know, saving your game, you don't have the option just to do that whenever you want. You have to find these golden crosses that are the only save points in the game. This is where playing on the original hardware versus playing an emulator are massively different, because in emulators, you can just use save states and you can save wherever you want. But if you're playing on the original hardware, the only options you have to save your game are these save points. You'll find a handful of them, and these are your only opportunities to save your progress. The same is true in Kingsfield 2. You need to find like these sort of idols, these icons, whatever they are, to, you know, save your progress, because if you die in Kingsfield, the game completely resets. If for some reason you are absolutely insane and did not save your game at any point during Kingsfield and you made it to the very end, you're at the last boss or something like that, if you died, you lost all of your progress. That's how like brutal these games were. Now obviously there's enough save points to where that doesn't realistically happen, but that plays into the core gameplay loop where you're trying to manage your resources and venture out just far enough because you feel like you've gotten so far away from your save point, you don't know if you should turn back or keep pushing to find another save point, and it feels heavenly when you do see that finally. It's very similar to how Dark Souls 1 is. But that's not the only similarity it has to Dark Souls 1, because one of the best aspects of that game, and particularly in the first couple of hours, is that you know those moments when you venture off really far, you're in the castle, and you come down on that elevator into Firelink Shrine, and you see that you looped all the way back to your save point. That is an absolutely mind-blowing moment, and while it's not quite as well done here, they still kind of do that a little bit. You do venture off into these dungeons, and you wrap around and get all all lost, only to find that you're actually just right on the coast of Malant and you're where you started. And by that point, though, hopefully you're a bit more powerful, maybe you found some better weapons. Things are usually just laying on the ground, or at least a lot of the first couple starting weapons, and the way that leveling works and the progression menu has been a little bit upgraded from the original Kingsfield. You do just level up by killing enemies. You don't need to like go to a save point or like a bonfire or whatever to level up. You just get more levels once you hit a certain XP threshold, but you still do need to be looking for things, and that mostly includes maps. In Dark Souls games, we pretty much don't have functional maps in the game exactly, or at least for navigation. Elden Ring would change this, and it does have a map, but that's actually more just for getting around different regions, and it's not necessarily for like moment-to-moment navigation exactly. Kingsfield, on the other hand, really places a large emphasis on maps, and they would get more functional and more detailed as the games would go on, but maps, even though they are a bit rudimentary in these earlier games, they're actually quite useful because other than just pure memorization, that's really your only, way to understand the lay of the land. Matter of fact, in Kingsfield 2 specifically, once you get into some of like the mines and later dungeons, it's actually useful to start drawing maps yourself with like a pen and paper. Getting around and navigating in Kingsfield is hard, especially if you already don't know what you're doing. Just like how Dark Souls 1 originally was, it's very difficult to figure out where you should go and what to do other than insane trial and error, or if you like have a guide or something. Keep in mind, Kingsfield again came out in the 90s, where the internet was in some of its most ancient forms, and we didn't have an endless stream of YouTube videos and or guides that you could look up to figure out how to beat or progress in a game. You did have internet forums, and there's even a few forums out there that are doing just this, that explain how to get through the game, explain what you should do. These things go back as far as like the late 90s. Kingsfield 1, the Japanese version, is simple enough to where that even if you don't have like a guide in front of you, or if you don't have some direction on where you're going, it's self-contained enough that if you explore the level and like interact with everything enough, eventually you're gonna find your way through progress and you're gonna make your way down to the final bits of the game. But in Kingsfield 2, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, or if it is, it's gonna take a lot longer because the game's level design, its visuals, and its layout are very confusing. What you're gonna notice is just like the original game, but even more so pronounced here, all of the levels and like the geometry of the structure of where you can go, it all looks the same. It's these endless hallways of stone that look identical to each other, and it's very easy to get lost. That's honestly part of the gameplay loop, or at least it was at the time, because you're supposed to be getting lost. You're supposed to be wandering around, not really know where you're going, and aimlessly walking into things for a little while. That was sort of the intention. That was actually the approach of many of these older games from that era, and even slightly after, is that you could only fit so much game on a disc or on a cartridge of what you were making. And so in order to sort of pad the game time, you had to make like either boss runbacks or level runbacks or something kind of tedious or challenging, because that is what would add to the time to completion. Because if you just skipped all that stuff, the game would be pretty short. Another thing I haven't touched on until now is navigation and controls, because specifically the only game to utilize the analog sticks on a PlayStation controller was the Ancient City, which is a PlayStation 2 game, but Kingsfield 1, 2, and 3 use the DualShock 1, which obviously doesn't even have analog sticks, so movement is really difficult to kind of like get a handle on. You use up and down on the D-pad to go back and forth, but you use the L1 and R1 to strafe left and right, and then you use L2 and R2 to look up or down. I literally don't know why they didn't flip the left and right functions of the buttons in the D-pad, because just moving around with the D-pad would make a lot more sense than trying to like strafe with the left and right bumpers. I don't know. It's very awkward feeling. Besides the map, or besides your memorization, the other navigation tool you do always have is the compass, and it's pretty useful. But what's even funnier is that if you're heading east, the compass perpetually looks like it just reads sex, which, to be fair, that would be a pretty interesting compass. Strangely though, Kingsfield, the Ancient City, or the last game in the series, would remove the compass off the screen, which was a controversial change, but we'll get to that later. And that fact, combined with Kingsfield 2's intentionally confusing level design, this is a game you can and will get very lost in. That's also due to the monotonous and repetitive layout of the designs as well. Now, with everything I've described so far, it might make sounding navigating and traversing in Kingsfield 2 and trying to get around Malant, whether you're actually at the coast or inside the mines or something like that, it might sound like a genuine nightmare. And to some degree, it is. In some parts, it absolutely is tedious, a little bit of a chore, or just not really well designed. You can actually trap yourself in these areas where there's these trap floors that if you don't have a key to get yourself out, you might be screwed unless you have a save point, or if you've made a save recently. Believe me, I know. I've done it. Now, once you get to some of these lower portions in these mines or, these dungeons, whatever, when you're fighting these enemies, you can see that there are a couple of these doors that are locked. And the way to open them is finding rhombus keys. These will unlock a handful of different locked areas in the game. Now, you can use a rhombus key to get access to a door, but it is a consumable, meaning it will leave your inventory. But if you're done with that room or if you're done with that lock, you can pick it back up, which is not very well explained to you, and I only figured that out by complete happenstance. It was a complete accident. I happened to be pressing the button when I was near a door and I picked the key up, which I think that a lot of people probably use it and assume it's a consumable and then never go back for their key again, because it just doesn't tell you that you can pick these back up once more. I haven't really talked about enemy types yet. I mean, in the original Kingsfield game, you have some interesting enemies for sure. You have these what are supposed to be these Venus flytrap plants, these flowers, and then you have these tree stumps, you have scorpions, you have lizards. As you get farther down, you get skeletons, you get all kinds of stuff like that, very fantasy things. Now, the man-eaters, these flowers, do appear in Kingsfield 2. You also now get kraken and other enemies like that, or termites. I always thought that specifically the man-eaters in Kingsfield 2 look like sliced watermelon more than they look like a plant or some kind of Venus flytrap. In Kingsfield 1, obviously it's rudimentary, but I can see what they're going for. In Kingsfield 3 even, they look a lot more like a proper Venus flytrap. They look like a man-eater. In Kingsfield 2, to me, this is sliced watermelon, bro. I mean, come on. Now, in the face of combat being pretty simple, on paper, the actual enemies can be still a challenge to deal with, and you do have some nuance to handling them. These snails in Kingsfield 2 spit this a goo or this venom at you that basically deals poison damage, and they can be extremely lethal. You need to run in and kind of get around them so that you're not in their line of sight and they can't spit at you. And you also don't want to hit their shell because they don't really take damage there, so you got to hit them where they're vulnerable, sort of near their neck or head area. This is a pretty reliable strategy for basically every enemy type in the game. As long as you can strafe and get behind them and deal damage to the back, there isn't much they can do about it. And also, Kingsfield 2's levels are so open in terms of the width of most areas that you have more than enough room to get around somebody, so it's not too bad. And it's also exactly why I think backstabs are so emphasized in the original Dark Souls or even Demon Souls. The old tried and true strategy of hugging an enemy's hip until you can just slip behind them and get a backstab is literally from this game, I personally think. Enemies have very interesting behavior in Kingsfield because unlike the Souls series, in which if you kill enemies in a certain area, they pretty much, without exception, only respawn if you fight a boss and reset the game, or if you touch a bonfire or something like that. If you reset the level, that's when the enemies come back in. But in Kingsfield, you don't even need to save or do anything. If enemies are not in your line of sight, if they're behind you and you've already killed them, there's a chance that they may or may not just be respawned for you. So if you try to backtrack the other way to go back to a save point because maybe you lost a lot more health than you were anticipating, you might have to fight those enemies all over again. There's really no consistency about whether an enemy is going to respawn or not. Even if you just let them out of your line of sight for 10 seconds, they could come right back. What this means, though, is that the gold economy and purchasing items is technically really broken, because a player with an extreme ungodly amount of patience could just sit there for hours or even days just farming the same enemies over and over again to stack up on gold and stack XP and just rank up, that you could basically out-level the rest of the game from the first room if you were determined enough. Now, most players aren't going to do that because a lot of the opening enemies don't give you a ton of gold or XP. Obviously, that is for harder enemies later in the game, but still, the concept still stands. I will say, compared to the first Kingsfield game, because that one is much smaller scale and the experience is more condensed, Kingsfield 2 being a little bit more fleshed out is a positive and a negative, because obviously there's more to explore and the map feels more alive and there's things to do, but also the levels can start to feel really monotonous. Every hallway looks exactly the same, and there's nothing visually spectacular, especially in modern day standards, about these, so they can get really tiresome on the eyes. Occasionally, though, you would have something to break up the monotony. For example, as you're leaving the coast of Malant, if you go sort of up these tunnels, you might just pop out on the other side to where you can actually see the sun, where in the coast you really can't see any light in the sky. So this is already a very stark contrast, and this is actually where you can meet a few of your first initial NPCs in the game. You can find merchants that will sell things to you and or do little quests for them. In terms of dialogue and quest, Kingsfield 1 was pretty limited. You would have occasional NPCs on the floors that you're in and would typically give you some illustration about the floor that you're currently on or what's to come yet deeper in the game. But in Kingsfield 2, you have more NPCs that are more referential to each other. It helps to really captivate this feeling of this world that is more interconnected. You'll have NPCs talking about her brother, which you'll find way down the road, and so on. It's like, it's very Elden Ring, it's very Dark Souls stuff that FromSoftware has always leaned on. Except for this guy who literally tells you he can't go explore in the mines because he's too fat. Now, I'm definitely no expert on the Kingsfield lore and storyline from my limited playing, but what I can gather from my experience is that Kingsfield 1 is a relatively simple fantasy story in which you save the kingdom with the Moonlight Sword, a witch grants you it at the end, and, you know, all is well. You actually have a happy ending. In Kingsfield 2, this sort of turns it on its head a little bit, where it reveals that the fairies, the one that even gave you the Moonlight Sword, was made in like a test tube. It was manufactured. Everything you thought you knew that was so fantastical was wrong. In Kingsfield 2, a god basically split into two dragons, Gyra and Seath. Yes, the same Seath from Dark Souls 1. These two dragons, a dark and a light, made respective swords, but one made the other. So the light dragon made the dark sword, and the dark dragon made the light sword. Goal is still pretty much the same as the first game, although now you're being drawn to the Moonlight Sword by the dragons themselves, and it seems that instead of playing as Jean that you play in the first game, you're actually Alfred this time. And again, just from my point of view, Kingsfield 2 is a great addition to the series that opens up a little bit more interesting background and lore to the stuff that was relatively simple and straightforward in Kingsfield 1, and now gives it a whole new connotation. Other than the last final encounter in Kingsfield 1 against Reinhardt, I don't think there's really many bosses to speak of. Kingsfield 2 actually does have a few bosses. Now, they're not a traditional Souls boss in which you walk through a fog wall and then you see a health bar pop up and you see its name. It's really just like a big giant enemy that is very clearly different from the others. Like in the Termite Cave, you'll see this giant one and it's blocking your path forward. It does a lot more damage. It has significantly more health than all of the minions around it, and you need to take care of it because it's in the path you need to traverse. There's a lot of rooms where it's like there's a big giant enemy that you know is the boss. So they're starting to play around with those ideas in Kingsfield 2 as well. I would say it's in this game that they really started to lean into secret rooms and illusory walls. You know, that's a big thing in the more modern FromSoftware titles, is rolling into a wall that looks pretty much just like the others, but it opens up revealing something secret, and occasionally these can be absolutely amazing. Sometimes it'll lead you to a treasure chest, other times your exploration will lead you to this whole other, like, world, basically, in which you discover that you can place these dragon stones down, which will then get the springs with flowing water again, and these springs can either heal your health or they can give you back MP. It's important to note that going back to a save point does not restore your HP or MP at all. Even though it's basically what the bonfire is in this game, it doesn't actually give you your resources back. That's why these springs are so important and so powerful, and there's an item called a crystal flask that you can use to basically put water in an empty flask to take with you. Because if you're out exploring and you run out of healing herbs or something and you're far away from a save point or there's not a spring nearby, what's in your flask that's mobile and carrying with you might be a lifesaver. As you get further into the game and the more ground you cover, if you've played Dark Souls, then you know that once you get to a certain point in the game, walking back to the area that you started with starts to become an overwhelming task. Like that could take upwards of 20 minutes maybe to walk on foot from one area to the other. So they have to introduce some kind of teleportation mechanic here. In Dark Souls, you get the Lord Vessel, which basically is the second half of the game that allows you to teleport anywhere, pretty much. In Kingsfield, however, you get these things that are like stargates, and if you have the corresponding key to your gate, you can pick and choose which areas you want to have access to teleport to. This, because it's a, finite resource, requires you to think strategically about what areas are the most comfortable for you or the ones that are the most advantageous and place your teleporter markers there. Kingsfield 2 definitely took a unique approach and had some very lofty ideas for the game. Upon expanding the lore and making a more intricate story, expanding the gameplay to where it's not just linear levels that are predictable in some sense. Unfortunately, some of its potential was held back by its visuals and some of its gameplay decisions, but by and large, it was an excellent exploration experience. Once you get past the first couple of hours, which can be a little bit rough, and you start getting access to different magic spells and all that kind of thing, Kingsfield 2 can be a very rewarding experience. It's the same kind of level exploration and the push and pull release of tension that is so good in the Dark Souls games. And then later on in 1996, we would get Kingsfield 3, which is the final game in the Verdite Chronicles. It's not the last Kingsfield game, and we'll get to that in a second, but Kingsfield 3 is, I think, essentially where the series peaks. And I mean that in a couple of ways. I mean that in the sense of its gameplay polish. I mean that in the decision making when it comes to designing a level, in the combat, and even in the story itself, because like I said, this was the end of the Verdite Chronicles. Even though the Ancient City is a Kingsfield game, the story is not related. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the back of the case real quick. Kingsfield 2, the Hour of Destiny is at hand. Your kingdom is once again under attack by the ruthless minions of evil. This time they have possessed King Alfred himself. As the king's son, Prince Lyle, you must bring forth the tide of change that will affect the universe from now on till the end of time. The fate of the world is in your hands. Re-enter the realm of Kingsfield for the most explosive debut on the PlayStation yet. Asahi Entertainment went all out to provide a fully non-linear, three-dimensional world that even blows away the original. The intense action and powerful storyline will keep you riveted for months. A virtual wonderland of sights and CD-quality sounds with an explosion of fearsome enemies, improved magic, and higher character definition. A larger, more realistic world fully rendered in beautiful 3D polygon graphics with texture mapping and a richer, deeper, and more intricate storyline that unfolds throughout your quest. Full color adventure and poster to equip you on your solitary journey. And I would say, you know what, as far as on the back of the case, most of that is actually fair. I mean, what they say is essentially what you get. The game does look better than the other Kingsfield games. Now, that is with the massive caveat that, yes, this is still stuck on the PlayStation 1, but they've made a lot of improvements to the visuals, even just from the very first game. When I look at the man-eater plants in Kingsfield 1 versus Kingsfield 3, could be a design thing, could be an actual polygon thing, but they look much better in this game, and they look like how they should. Also, real quick, I have to show you the unedited Kingsfield 3 intro because the audio mixing and the voiceover, it all comes together. It's just incredible. I'll let you watch it.
Darkness fell upon the land of Verdite. Its once lush forests and great mountains now bowed before the will of the fallen Holy King. No one could explain the fall of the king. 15 years ago, Alfred had slain Verdite's festering evil and had risen triumphant as the new king. Now Verdite watched in horror as the ancient evil returned to the form of their king. They cried out for Alexander, who had brought back the Moonlight Sword 5 years ago. The foul stench of evil permeated the tower as Alex ventured forth to take up the holy sword. It was too late. The sword was broken. With the Moonlight Sword broken, Alex prepared for his meeting with Destiny. He bestowed upon the Chosen Four the powers necessary to protect the kingdom. The castle began to shimmer with the brilliance of light as Alex's will was directed at its proud walls. He uttered a final word: peace. And the rest was silence. With his final thoughts, Alex sent these words to Lyle, the king's son. Lyle, in the days ahead, you must grow stronger than you ever thought you could. You must receive the power from the Four and break my seal to face your father. I will guide you with the hours of hand. You must take up the sword of your father and win back your kingdom. The future is in your hands. With this, Alex gave up his soul. For 10 years, Lyle carried the burden of being prince to a damned kingdom. Now old enough to understand the message etched in his mind forever, it's time he faced his destiny.
The intro is just so good, dude. The game immediately from the very first frame emanates style, and the intro already set the tone for it brilliantly. The visuals have been changed to some degree, and most importantly, the man-eaters look good again. No more sliced watermelon, they actually look like real, proper Venus flytraps. And their claims about the storyline are not wrong either. It is definitely the peak of the Verdite Chronicles, and yes, you do play as Lyle, which is the king's son. Alfred, who you play as in Kingsfield 2, is now basically the villain, and so it's kind of like it's Star Wars, right? It's Luke versus Vader. I mean, hell, you practically get given a lightsaber at the beginning of this game, as opposed to both other Kingsfield titles in which right in the beginning of the game you're scrounging around trying to find your first couple of weapons or whatever. In this game, some old guy literally hands you the Excellator, which may as well be a lightsaber. The more you use it, the more powerful it becomes, and it's not necessarily like the weapon you should stick with all the time in the game, but it is a very reliable starting weapon that feels like you're already past square one. I think what I really liked about Kingsfield 3 right when I started playing was that after getting familiar with the feel and the general gameplay loop of the first two games, Kingsfield 3 just lets you hit the ground running. Once again, no explanation, no setup, there's not any dialogue like explaining how to do combat, you just get right into it, and this time you literally spawn in the King's Field. You know, it's called Kingsfield, but in the first game, you spawn in these closed-in claustrophobic dungeons. In Kingsfield 2, you spawn on the coast of Malant. In Kingsfield 3, you're actually in the field this time. And a massive shift in vibe, tone, and atmosphere is apparent right away as you have a massive open field in front of you, but most of it is shrouded behind the fog, behind what you can't see. So while it is open, it still feels dangerous. It feels uncertain, and it feels unknown. The sky is this very foreboding red, and the music fits perfectly. As far as setting a tone and an atmosphere right away on first impressions, Kingsfield 1 and 2 have their moments, and there are aspects that I really appreciate about them, but Kingsfield 3 is the one that I felt like was the most intentional and got it right immediately. You can walk around the field, explore, start interacting with NPCs in their huts right away, and this is excellent at setting the tone as like this is a safe area, or at least was relatively safe. You have the statue of the hero here, you have your merchant, and this feels like a home base to a large extent, and this is where you do most of your shopping before going out into the world, and specifically venturing into Verdite Castle. Now, on the back of the case, they make the claim that this is a non-linear, almost open world style of game, and I have some issues with that claim. I mean, I definitely see what they're saying, as in it's not a closed-in space like the linear Kingsfield 1 games were, but I will say that as far as game progression goes, I would say it's actually a little bit more linear than even Kingsfield 2. And that's mostly down to the level progression of the game, because while it may not be quite as obvious, this does have levels like the original Kingsfield. It's not quite as interconnected world as Kingsfield 2, but the open world claim, I guess, makes sense because a lot of it is spent in this outdoor field where, yeah, it does feel pretty non-linear in a way. So I don't have a problem with them labeling it as that. And you do get a lot more atmosphere and lore to dig into because there's a lot more NPCs and you spend more time interacting with them and hearing their stories. There's this overwhelming sense of suffering and dread that emanates from the NPCs at every possible moment, and when it comes to selling an atmosphere, these characters do a fantastic job. I was hooked right from the very beginning, and you might think that it's hard to be hooked on a game that looks so antiquated like this does, and you do feel that for a little while, but after playing for a couple of hours, you start to just get lost in the world that it is and don't really care about the visuals as much. And also, I do think with a very minimally visual representation, your imagination starts to fill in the gaps, and that can make the experience feel a lot more meaningful. It's the same reason that I feel sometimes a book can be better than watching a movie of the same story. I gotta be honest, this might sound kind of weird, but getting used to these visuals, or at least staring at them for multiple hours during my play sessions, I started to get used to them to a point where when I was done, it started to make real life look weird by contrast. I would, look at my hands and be like, oh my god, life is in 120 FPS versus this like 25 or 30 frames that I'm looking at forever. I think what I enjoyed most about Kingsfield 3, other than them selling the atmosphere to me right off the bat, is that they started to figure out better game design techniques and were getting more clever with how they put things together, and specifically the way you obtain your magic, the way you get through the castle. It all makes sense, it's intuitive, and it's interesting to go through. Each little area is its own self-contained little puzzle in which you need to find one of these like Silveria's key. You can never really get too lost or too stuck because the solution isn't that far away. You just have to be looking close enough to find it, and that's something I can really get behind. You might have to talk to an NPC to get a curse to like lift the curse off her son or whatever to get your first spell. You might venture really far into the castle using all of your leftover keys and being very low on resources, only to find a majestic spring on the other side. Even though the main content is much more linear in Kingsfield 3, there is quite a lot of side content to go after as well that isn't necessarily mandatory, but it's there for you if you want it, and it makes the world feel a lot more alive, especially as it relates to NPCs and their quests, because they're the most involved they've ever been in this game for the Kingsfield series. And there's something about entering Verdite Castle for the first time. I'm not joking when I say this. This was the most creeped out I felt from a video game in a very long time. And I don't know if you guys can relate, but there's something about low quality visuals to me that are inherently much more frightening, that entering this castle like actually gave me jitters. The atmosphere is top notch despite the game looking literally like Minecraft. Unfortunately, that is one of the hard drawbacks that I noticed to this one, is that after like you enter the castle and stuff, you have these different areas you can go and explore, and they're totally different regions, right? They're different biomes, different areas with their own enemy types, NPCs, and so on, and visuals to mention. But that's kind of the problem, is that you can see this really hard juxtaposition of the castle texture versus like whatever the next place is. This leaf one, or this forest, for example, was actually so nauseating for me to look at when you're venturing through this. And under normal conditions, I'm fine looking at that stuff, but it was something about the intensity of the pixel shifting in this area that like really made me nauseous. And it's also a little bit unfortunate that if you want to sell a more natural looking biome, it doesn't help when everything is so squared off and geometrical and you see these hard ridge lines everywhere. It makes sense when you're in a castle, right, which is a polygon man-made structure. It's very geometric, but in something more like a forest, that kind of straight edges everywhere in nature doesn't really gel well. And I know people are thinking, wow, this guy's complaining about visuals on a game that's 30 years old, which I know how it sounds, but it must be pointed out. The actual puzzles within these biomes are pretty cool though. You get a key that like turns tree stumps, or it removes them, giving you access to different areas. It's super neat, and they're playing around with with different traps and mechanics and different ways to interact with the level that are not just clearing enemies and walking down the hallway. They were getting more clever about everything, which I can really appreciate. Later on, you can use certain boots to walk across a water bridge, and really playing into these fantasy elements and taking them to the very limits that the PlayStation 1 was capable of. But the most important part, though, gameplay-wise, is that Kingsfield 3 does still indeed have the sex compass. In terms of story, this was the grand finale for the Verdite Chronicles, and the ending is basically Star Wars. It is Prince Lyle defeats and redeems his father. At the same time, there's actually two endings to Kingsfield. One where you fall prey to Seath once again and the cycle continues, or you resist him and, redeem your father. And of course, the Moonlight Sword being at the forefront of all of this. I don't know what it was about Kingsfield 3 specifically that really scratched the itch for me, but it absolutely hit the mark on pretty much everything I was looking for, even on a game this old. I knew what I was getting myself into, yet this game exceeded my expectations. The Verdite Chronicles between Kingsfield 1, 2, and 3 would have an amazing setup and a satisfying conclusion, and a ton of lore that was built between all of these games. And then after Kingsfield 3, the franchise would go away for a while. It would be a few years before any other Kingsfield games would release, but eventually it would come back on the newest generation of hardware, the PlayStation 2, with the release of Kingsfield 4 in Japan, or in the US and Europe, Kingsfield: The Ancient City.
The cursed land lies deep in a dense, colorless forest. Hidden within this land is an ancient city, once known to the forest folk as the Holy Land. Buried in the depths of the city, a warning was discovered long after the rulers have fallen. Grave misfortune will befall those who behold the idol that stares into the darkness. The idol, taken from the ancient land, led the kingdom down a path of destruction. The idol must be returned. Under a dark and cloudy sky, the Swordmaster led his men to the ancient land. The cursed land swallowed the soldiers, and all that remained was dark silence.
Now, right away, you can tell that the visuals of this game are already very different. It's no longer the rough, shifting pixels that the original games were, and an actually fairly decent-looking game. And I mean that even kind of by today's standards. And I don't know if it was just because I got so used to looking at the pixels of the first 3 games, but when it came time to play the Ancient City, I was like, damn, this is on the PlayStation 2, but it actually looks like really quality. Now we'll check out the back of the game case to see what it has to say about itself. An accursed idol responsible for the destruction of an ancient race has resurfaced to wreak havoc once again among the kingdoms of man. You must return the idol to the ancient city to break its curse, but monsters of unspeakable horror haunt the ruins. There is a palpable fear in the air of the ancient city. Even the monsters themselves fear the evil that has returned. Treasures beyond imagination await the warrior bold enough to attempt the journey, strong enough to face the minions of death, and wise enough to follow the path that leads to the essence of light. Use your sword arm well to rid the land of a potent curse. Be aware that should the sword fail, you have the magical arts to serve you in your quest. Learn the proper time and place for each, or you shall too be counted amongst those lost forever. First-person exploration RPG that immerses you into the 3D rendered world of Kingsfield with an all-new story and incredible graphics. more than 40 areas of non-linear exploration where you seek upgrades for your weapons and armor, as well as components for magic spells. Unlock the art of using powerful spells, discover items long forgotten in secret areas, and learn valuable knowledge from characters you meet. More than 100 unique monsters and villains, each with their own arsenal of attacks and defenses, ready to claim their next victim. A plethora of weapons, armor, rings, and more await you in discovery and use. Now, this game's premise does not focus on the Verdite Castle or even Melant or any of that stuff. It is entirely its own thing, and now is about this idol that's like cursed that you need to place down at the bottom of this labyrinth. And it's basically getting back to the dungeon crawling roots for Kingsfield. I think Kingsfield 4 could have done a lot of things. It could have went a couple of different directions, but the one they chose was to kind of come full circle, and it's actually more akin to the original Kingsfield game, in my opinion. Something that took me by surprise a little bit, or definitely took some getting used to, was the changes to the visuals on the HUD. I had gotten so used to looking at actual damage numbers and like health points and MP on my top left, but they changed it to like more like what Diablo looks like. You still have your power bar and your MP and all that, but it looks different here, and you don't have numbers. But most importantly, this game got rid of the sex compass. And to tell you the truth, I couldn't even begin to tell you why. I don't know if there's any good reason for them to have removed the compass from this game. It really helps when it comes to navigation, but because this is less open-ended and it is a lot more about linear dungeon crawling, I guess it makes sense and it's not too much of a hindrance. It just seems like a weird part of the game to remove that was so staple to what Kingsfield is. But I will say the most shocking thing of all to me was that the gameplay pace was not what I expected. In Souls titles, pretty much since the beginning of Demon Souls, the games have gradually gotten faster. The bosses' movesets have gotten more complex, combat has gotten quicker, and the game's speed overall has increased tremendously to a point where you can compare something like Night Rain to Dark Souls or Demon Souls, and they're not even really the same game anymore. And with that in mind, I was expecting the same to be true of Kingsfield: The Ancient City. After playing the first 3 games, my expectation was, oh, combat's going to be faster, the movement's going to be quicker, it's going to be more fluid, all this stuff. What I found was the complete opposite. They actually made the game significantly slower than the other games. In terms of movement and in terms of combat pacing, it is much slower than those older games. Now, I think this was done for a few reasons. I believe they wanted to give Kingsfield the atmosphere that they always intended for it. They really wanted to sell the environment that you're in, and they can achieve that by making the player slow down and take in their environment a lot more. If the gameplay was a lot more fast-paced and more focused on combat, it might detract from what they were going for from an atmospheric perspective. And also, because of the structure of the temple and the way that you traverse down through the ancient city, the game is really about puzzle levels and like paying attention to your environment, so a fast movement speed might cause you to miss really key details about traps in certain rooms and all this stuff that I think the combat kind of takes a back seat to it. That wasn't all the major changes or additions that the Ancient City made to its predecessors, namely, they actually changed the way the equipment menu works, and now you're actually forced to interact with it more and understand it because now elements have weight to them. This is what we would see in Demon Souls and in Dark Souls. All of the equipment, weapons, etc. that you'll find throughout your adventure have a weight when applied to your character, so you have to keep that in mind. Also, this would be the first game to introduce weapon durability, and that's a thing that I, hate that I have to say. I've never felt that weapon durability was a good mechanic in virtually any game, and I still don't think it's a really good mechanic here for a lot of reasons, but this would be the start of it, and Dark Souls 3 would be the end of it. You can just look at the UI and the design, and you can see that this is an early version of what the Demon Souls and Dark Souls UI would look like, and the way that you interact with weapon durability, the NPCs, and so on. It all definitely has callbacks to this game. Kingsfield is basically the first-person version of Demon Souls with a couple of exceptions. As opposed to other Kingsfield titles, they made the environment much more interactive this time, and one of the big things is that in the early game you might find a pickaxe, which allows you to to break down wooden barriers, which you would never have been able to do that in a prior Kingsfield game, so it's definitely a new mechanic to have in this one. Also, you get introduced to it very early on, but now you can swim. Being able to traverse underwater and including water in these puzzle levels, you now have to manage this oxygen bar on top of your health, on top of your power. It's a lot of things to keep track of at once, but it adds to the growing complexity and intricacy of these levels. I will say this, from a game design perspective, the Ancient City is by far the best game in Kingsfield. However, I cannot say it's my favorite. I just honestly didn't have the patience for how slow and methodical this game was. The original Kingsfield games are already much slower compared to like modern Souls titles or other FromSoftware games, but the Ancient City is like slow even in comparison to other Kingsfield games. And again, I know why that is. It's intentional. They want you paying attention to the environment. It's about the puzzles and solving and all that stuff. You need to pay attention to details. So a slower, more methodical game makes sense here. It's just not my personal preference, and that's okay. A lot of people will prefer a very slow game like this as opposed to something more, fast-paced and cracked out like we're playing now in Night Rain. It's an objectively extremely well-designed game that packs a lot of content and a lot of engaging fun within just a couple of hours. These games really aren't that long to beat. We're used to like 80-hour RPGs now in modern day, but you can beat these Kingsfield games in pretty much just a handful of hours. You can beat them in a single day if you really want to. But I think the Ancient City is the Kingsfield game that really laid the groundwork for not only Demon Souls to be developed, but then subsequently after the rest of the Souls franchise. For a while, Demon Souls was going to be a first-person game, and I think a lot of that was due to their inspiration and already experience that they had making Kingsfield. At some point, it got turned into a third-person game, which of course changed history, but in the beginning, it started out more like this. Now, just because it doesn't focus on the Verdite Chronicles doesn't mean the Moonlight Greatsword isn't a part of it, and it's not the end goal, because it absolutely is. That is the finale of the Kingsfield series, because after this game, there would never be another one made. Kingsfield 4, The Ancient City, has its design most in common with Kingsfield 1, albeit with a lot more sophisticated game design and much more powerful technology, but it's a bit of a full circle moment for the franchise with its emphasis on truly dungeon crawling and level clearing. Finding sigils to take you to the next level and refresh your armor and equipment is the whole gameplay loop. It feels like Kingsfield 4 is the game that Kingsfield 1 wanted to be from the start. While I don't really think it fits in well with the rest of the series, both visually and from a narrative point of view, I can appreciate the objectively good game design and the expansion of the rudimentary yet potentially awesome ideas that they were playing with in Kingsfield 1 to 3. For whatever reason though, this game just didn't really click with me as much as the others, despite it being a mile ahead visually and mechanically. It's objectively the best game, I can admit that. And not to mention, the game does have spectacular vibes. There's this real sense of abandonment, almost a haunting, this looming dread that's always lurking, and it's very engaging in that way, and it has by far the best soundtrack as well. I must point that out. I think mostly what didn't really click for me was the gameplay pace felt like it was slowed down to a crawl, and now that maybe, I have brain rot and playing games like Elden Ring or Night Rain has made me prefer a game that's too fast-paced, and so Kingsfield in comparison feels like it's like being in a fighter jet versus then getting in a wooden kayak. It's like there's a time and place for both for sure, and I can appreciate a well-crafted wooden kayak, absolutely. It just didn't really do it for me as much as even the other Kingsfield games did. Even though those are slow, there was something about this one that was too slow for me. Now, this raises the question, given that the Ancient City went so far as to essentially reboot the series and give it a new story and potentially opening up the world to a lot more possibilities, would there ever be another Kingsfield game? I mean, the latest one was on the PS2, and we're now currently on the PlayStation 5. Would there ever be hope of another title? The only thing I believe FromSoftware has officially said about the series is that they don't feel comfortable making more Kingsfield games without its original creator. So essentially, there is no chance at all that an official Kingsfield game would be made. I just don't see them taking that approach. And also, not to mention, FromSoftware has this sort of legacy where people expect these like fast-paced, harder games, and you could argue about whether that's right or wrong, but I do think them releasing a very slow burn, slow-paced Kingsfield game in modern day would be definitely off-putting to some, and it would be a game that's certainly not for everyone. everyone. Not that FromSoftware always makes games for everyone to begin with, but I just don't think that this kind of game would do very well with a modern audience. That did not stop me from going back to play these though. Once I fall in love with the series, I like to go back through the publisher's history and play their back catalog, and so Kingsfield became the obvious choice, and I was delighted at every single moment that I could see the roots of the things that I love so much about the newer FromSoftware games, how they have their origins in Kingsfield. A lot of the things that we've come to know and love would never exist without the series of games that you may have never heard of or even played. Now that raises the question, can I honestly recommend that you guys play Kingsfield in the modern day if you haven't? Well, that's tricky because it really depends on if you can get access to it. Now, obviously, emulators are one thing. That's pretty much your only real possibility of playing all of the games if you want to do that without spending a ton of money, because it's pretty hard to get your hands on the original copies, and you need a region-free PlayStation to play the first game if you're determined to play it on its original hardware. Not that it's impossible, but there's a lot of hurdles to overcome to not only play but also enjoy Kingsfield. You need to overcome the hurdle of being able to play the game to begin with, either on hardware or an emulator. You need to overcome the big obstacle of the antiquated visuals and antiquated game design. I mean, lads, these games are from the 90s. These aren't just like, early PS3 games or whatever, early 2000s. I mean, these games are literally older than me. I think if you've watched this video and you're really interested in playing Kingsfield, you should go ahead and try it. Otherwise, I think you can kind of get the gist by watching gameplay or, watching a video like this, just kind of going over it. It's something that you should experience for yourself if you really feel called to do it. But I just don't think that this kind of game design and this pace of especially for like newer FromSoftware fans, I don't think it's going to quite do it for you. But I don't know, fans of like old Skyrim and stuff like Oblivion, you might actually like it more than Souls fans, I would wager. Going back and experiencing Kingsfield was an enlightening journey that I will certainly never forget, and it's given me a newfound appreciation for the modern games that I really do enjoy. The Dark Souls series, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, even Sekiro, everything really has its roots back in here, whether you realize it or not, and these games wouldn't exist had it not been for Kingsfield. In a bubble, I cannot honestly say that I'm in love with the Kingsfield gameplay or the series, but it's certainly very interesting, and for the time, they had a lot of fascinating ideas that they were able to execute to varying degrees. And at this point, it's also safe to make the assumption that there will never be another Kingsfield game, because FromSoftware will not dig this IP back up without the original creator, and that's just not going to happen at this point. So Kingsfield was an unforgettable journey, and it's something that is worth remembering.